Just be another minute as we're getting our live stream started on YouTube. You can feel free to share with folks a link to YouTube if they'd like to watch and they weren't able to register ahead of time. I'll share that in the chat in just another minute. Okay, welcome once again, everyone. We are all set on YouTube. And so I'm going to just ask Kathy McGinnis, who is one of the leaders of the Catholic Racial Justice Collaborative and a Pax Christi USA Teacher of Peace, to get us started. Kathy, it's all yours. You'll need to unmute yourself.
Thanks, Johnny. And I want to, on behalf of the Catholic Racial Justice Collaborative, Pax Christi USA, and the Institute for Peace and Justice, want to welcome all of you. To tell you how happy we are to have the number of people that we have coming to today's session. I know that the whole issue of exploring white nationalism is something that's critical for people all over the country. And I realize that you all are from all over the country, so we're absolutely excited that you're all here today. And I get to introduce first Carolyn Yandel, who's going to open us with a song. And Carolyn is from my parish, the same parish that I go to, and I know how wonderful she is in terms of singing. So Carolyn, would you just take it?
Amen. If I can help as I pass alone, if I can cheer somebody with a word or song, if I can show somebody they are traveling home, then my living shall not be in vain. If I can do my duty as a Christian art, if I can bring my beauty to a world if I can spread as the master taught, then my living shall not be in vain. Then my living be in vain. If I can have some as I pass alone, then my living then my living shall not be in vain.
Thank you, Carolyn, very much. And now our opening prayer is going to be led by Father Steve Benden, who is the pastor of St. Alphonsus Rock Church in St. Louis. Father Steve.
Thank you. We ask you, Lord, to bless us this day in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Dear Lord, as we gather here today, we ask you to open our hearts to your love, your life, your presence in our lives. The sin of racism is still very present in our world today. We ask you, please, to be with us this day and humble us. Yes, Lord, we ask you to humble us this day and to instill within us a sense of openness. Lord, we ask you to open our hearts to know all people have been created in your image and likeness, and no one has the right to dominate. No one has the right to subjugate any other person because of the color of their skin. Please be with Father Brown today and inspire him with your word. And let your spirit be with all of us. May you, Lord, bless us all as we are gathered together in your name, through Christ our Lord. Amen.
Thank you, Father. And then now also from St. Alphonsus Rock Church is the co-chair of the Catholic Racial Justice Collaborative, Sharon Cooney-Smith, who will introduce our speaker for us. Sharon.
Good morning. Am I unmuted?
You are.
Yes, I am. Okay. So, gosh, it's my pleasure. I've done this on a number of occasions, and I'm in such awe of Father Brown because I met him a long time ago when he was directing liturgy for a couple of conferences that I was attending. And I was just so impressed with his ability to plan and carry out those liturgies that were wonderful. And he's an author, he's a professor, he's a drum major for justice, which is, those are such important things. He was born and raised in East St. Louis, Illinois. This past summer, he celebrated 50 years of ordination. He's written all kinds of books. And one of the things that I use consistently as a co-chair of the Liturgy Commission at the Rock Church is his book, Sweet, Sweet Spirit, Prayer Services in the Black Catholic Tradition. We've incorporated so many things that Father Brown has expressed. He's taught me just by observing him how important it is to understand the symbolism. A lot of things are added to liturgy without the folks who added understanding what it means. And so I got that. And I got that from observing him, listening to him, and reading his writings. So I'm always thrilled and honored to be able to introduce him when he's speaking, because I look on him as a mentor, not a colleague, because I'm not where he is, but a friend. And that to me is very important. I appreciate his knowledge, and I'm so honored when he congratulates me on the preparation and the planning of the liturgy when he's come to the Rock Church to grace us with his preaching and his presence. And he'll say, y'all did a good job. And I'm like, yes, we did a good job. I'm going to write it down. Father Joseph said, so I know we're okay. We ain't perfect, far from it, but we're okay because we're paying attention. And he taught us the importance of being authentically Black and positively Catholic. Absolutely. And so you've read things on the flyer. Those of you who have heard him speak before, the things that I'm saying here are not new, that you understand how important it is to have someone who's steeped in Black Catholicism to speak to us on this issue of white nationalism. And so with further ado, let me stop talking and allow him to speak to you. And so I want to present to some and introduce to others the Reverend Dr. Joseph Brown. Amen.
And thank you, Sharon. for setting me up so that I will really feel completely nervous and racked with anxiety. It's not every day. Well, actually, it is every day that happens to me, but that's all right. And I'm going to be honest about this. The topic came to me when the introduction was sent, and I thought, do I really want to do this? Because there could be a whole shelf. Well, there is a whole shelf of books on just this topic. And I don't mean just one little row. I mean the whole bookshelf on these topics. And so I'm going to apologize beforehand that I'm going to be shifting around with a whole bunch of different notes and quotations because there's so much to be focused on. But on another level, it is extremely simple. And this is where we have to understand that white nationalism has always been part of our culture because it is the problem of colonialism and even the scientific racism studies of the 17th century and the 18th century, the classification of the species, the whole hierarchy of humanity. And you've got people writing in the 1700s telling us that white is at the top and black is at the bottom of every categorization. And then they go out of their way to say terrible things about the bottom people on the ladder of being, the chain of being. And we all know this somewhere intuitively, but to know it in any kind of a studied academic sort of way can wear you down and wear you out. And which is one of the reasons why I thought Carolyn's song was so helpful, because in the Roman Catholic Church in America, but across the world actually, the missionary tendency has always actually, in my mind, helped to reinforce notions of racism. It has. Not everywhere and in all cases and in every group, but it has reinforced it. When you stop and think about, we're going to come and help you people get to heaven someday, not today, but someday, maybe after you're dead. And the problematic arguments about the people who have been elevated as heroes of our church, those problematic elements have got to be studied quite clearly. And when we get into America, it starts on the most basic level possible. And I'm going to start with this theme, and then I'm going to keep wandering around and coming back to it. But I've got to read it because, after all, what else are we here for? We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and to our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. Now, I could do probably 45 minutes on just this preamble. We the people. One of my great mentors and angels of blessing in my life, Bob Moses, the great civil rights hero, human rights activist, gentle spirit of prophecy. His last great project was the We the People project, asking the question, when are we all going to be included in We the People? But if you want to get to nationalism, it's spelled out in the Constitution's preamble. We the people. Well, ain't no women allowed. Ain't no Native Americans allowed. Ain't no Africans allowed. We the people. White, male landowners who want to make sure that their posterity inherits everything they've got, including the people that work for them, either as indentured servants or as permanent, racially enslaved creatures of God. We, the people. And we can go back and watch Broadway musicals if we want to, with John Adams' wife writing him saying, "Remember the women, John, remember the women." But we'd also have to read the letter that she wrote saying, slavery is abhorrent and you've got to do something to get rid of it. But we don't read that one, because that's not what the dominating narrative wants us to read. And that's my issue for this morning, the dominating narrative. It really is simple, but it's very complex, because I just have been working for weeks on trying to get the right substantive examples of how so many different people have expressed the notion of white nationalism. But I'm going to rely so much on James Baldwin and Toni Morrison and A. Leon Higginbotham and George Lipsitch. Well, okay, so that's going to be half of my quotations. But the one person I want to start with is another one of my great mentors of social justice, the late Reverend Al McKnight. Al McKnight worked in Louisiana and around the country for years and years and years. When he retired in his 70s, he went to Haiti to work there to help the people of Haiti rebuild and restore after all the climate destructiveness that that island has received. But Haiti is central to what we're doing here, because nationhood and white nationhood has been in a wrestling match, an agonistic confrontation with Haiti ever since Haiti fought for its own independence. Thomas Jefferson wasn't happy about that. None of the founding fathers were happy about that. And as we see what's happened with Haiti today, the poorest nation in the hemisphere, just within a few decades ago, France finally settled its reparations demands with Haiti. Haiti had to pay France money for their liberation. France was still making a profit into the 20th century for Haiti becoming free. And the great threat that Haiti presented helped to establish a lot of the rules, regulations, and policing of America. Because the United States founding fathers, who subscribed to and signed off on this document, the Constitution, were afraid that the people here, the domestic Africans, would get the wrong idea from what Haiti did and try to do it here. How else do we get the Second Amendment to the Constitution, which establishes the policing of the state, which we are still facing today as one of the most horrendous examples of this so-called democracy? But as a teacher, I keep having to say to students and to anybody else who will either listen or don't know how to mute me, who defines the terms by which we live? And this comes down to white nationalism. Because just the very notion of white is a political, economic factor. We define people for our benefit and our understanding and our security. We, the people. You ain't the people. And the Constitution is quite clear about that. Quite clear. The compromises that the Northern and Southern delegates to the Constitutional Convention, the compromises that they enacted, were in favor of the slaveholding South and some of the slaveholding North. They couldn't do otherwise, because the economics of America was cemented by enslavement. Al McKnight, one summer I was teaching at the Institute for Black Catholic Studies in New Orleans, and Al McKnight decided to take my class. Now, if that's not traumatizing, I wouldn't know what would be. This man, there is no way, and I'm so glad to see that the link about him is already in the chat room. But he got up from the class and said, can I just say a few words? Of course you can say a few words, Father McKnight. And he wrote on the board, values command politics. Values command politics. And that floated right up into my consciousness, my canon law class back in theology studies, when my canon law professor, a canon lawyer himself, the first book in our canon law class was The Godfather by Mario Puzo, because he wanted us to see how a community's values are enforced and reinforced by the rules and regulations they begin. And he thought, if you can understand this through this novel, then you can understand how the church and every other social organization comes into being and sustains itself. It's human relationships, and how do we maintain some kind of stability, consistency, and comfort. But somebody's got to write the rules and somebody's got to enforce them. Now, who defines the terms? So he wrote, values command politics. And then the next line was, politics command economics. Okay, I have a certain value system, and I'm going to organize a cultural, sociological system to help keep my values paramount. I'm going to build a society around my values. If hospitality is one of the great values of my family, then my mother and father are going to make sure that I always open the door and say, how are you doing? And is there anything we can give you? It starts off that basic. Now, politics command economics. America is a capitalist system. Colonialism is a capitalist system. You take the resources and you make a profit off of them. The material, mineral, geographic, and human resources, and you make a profit off of them. And then the third line he wrote on the board that day was, and economics command education and techniques. Values, politics, economics, education. Our formal educational system in this country and our informal media education system reinforces the values that make America great. Make America great. Colonialism, policing, and it's not about to ensure the domestic tranquility. The domestic tranquility of the preamble, if there's anything that explains the Second Amendment, it's that phrase. Ensure domestic tranquility. When we stop and think about how many slave rebellions and native indigenous peoples fights to reclaim their land or their autonomy, those insurrections and rebellions, there were at least 50 of them before the Constitution was ratified. They needed policing, first of all, to stop the runaways, to get the best work out of them, and to make sure that the people whose land they took couldn't come back and take it back. So they needed to have a militia. And that militia was to police the non-whites and the poor whites, the indentured servants. But let us remember this. Whiteness is an evolutionary idea in America. Who defines the terms? A young man who is a former student of mine and a dear forever friend, 2 weeks ago did a workshop in Dublin, Ireland. And he wrote back and said, the Irish are absolutely wonderful. It's the American white people I can't stand because they're proving that they're white. But the Irish are not like that. And I said, you have to remember, the Irish weren't white until second or third generations of them got into America, because the Irish were known to need to break free of the British oppression and enslavement. That is who the Irish were, and to some extent in the British mentality still are. But then they came to America. And let's just keep hearing that word Irish, because that's going to fit everything else we're doing today. They came here, but so many of the ethnic groups came here as ethnic outsiders, either tolerated or for some economic reason allowed in to do some necessary work. And that has been the form of American Catholicism, of capitalism rather, no matter what generation we're in. And the lies that get told about we are a melting pot, that's not a I'm sorry. We're not a melting pot. The melting pot is really a stew of assimilation, because the melting pot means that the Irish, the Lithuanians, the Germans, the Poles, the Ukrainians, the French, the Italians melted into whiteness. The Native Americans did not melt. The Black folks cannot melt. And the tragedy is, people will say this, well, you know, race isn't real, it's a social construct. Tell that to a police officer who stops me on the street some night. Social construct can get you killed. Tell that to some people going into some kind of a liberation meeting out in South Dakota in the 1960s. Or the people at Wounded Knee in the 1800s. Social construct, absolutely. And look at the effects of that social construct. We talk about the great heroes of the civil rights movement. We consider the modern civil rights movement in this country, starting with, say, Brown versus Board of Education. But you've got people now writing books about how the Black soldiers in the Second World War were the victims of racial prejudice, lynching, destructive behaviors, because they weren't supposed to be equals to the people that they were fighting to defend the liberty for. But every war America's ever had has had Black men and women in it. Look at what we can put Harriet Tubman's face on a dollar bill, but look at how long it took her. She never did get the pension she deserved, because she was a soldier in the Union Army. Oh, we're going to come up with she was the scout. She was this, she was that. She had a gun and she was fighting. I call that being a soldier. And she wasn't the only woman in the Union Army, or probably the Confederate Army. But we don't want to talk about that, because nationalism is not just about race. It's about gender, class, a whole bunch of different things. Who defines the terms by which we live? And we know who defined them. The people who wrote this book called the Constitution defined them. And you stop and think about the role of the Supreme Court from the very beginning. Think about the Dred Scott decision. Think about Plessy versus Ferguson. Think about the restrictions and the diminution of voting rights starting about 15 to 20 years ago. When you stop and think about just Brown versus Board of Education, look at the public school system today. There was an article in yesterday's newspaper down here in Southern Illinois about the incredible teacher shortage that's going to be confronting this country in the next 10 years. But the state of Illinois has already got a teacher shortage. And so you're putting people who are not trained into the classrooms to do double, triple work. How is that going to benefit the students in the poor public school districts all over this urban world or the rural world? Understaffed, undereducated, and the students are going to come out underprepared. And you stop and think about it. The schools are based on property taxes. Well, if you have been denying Blacks and other people of color opportunities to get loans, to have good paying jobs, because the kinds of jobs they would have been doing 50 years ago moved out of the country. So you can't count on a consistent employment history as people could have done 75 to 80 years ago. So now you got people scrambling without the ability to buy property, which means they cannot have generative wealth, which means that they can't hand anything over to their children except the fear of being evicted from an apartment. that may also have lead problems in the water and the paint, which is going to affect your ability because you may wind up with learning disabilities and learning challenges in how you study. But that's all you can afford because the system has said you don't deserve anything more than that. And it's the system who draws the lines. Nationalism. Think about how America's wars, domestic, on the continent wars, have all been fought to increase land for economic benefit and control. And all that land came from non-white people who had been here forever. But we need this land to expand our economic advantages. And so often that meant, up until the 1860s, enslavement of other human beings. The Mexican-American War. We need to expand our territories. The military incursions into Nicaragua and other places in Latin America from the 1850s to the 1950s for the protection of the economic interest that went in to exploit and pretty much destroy the economies of the people who are indigenous. White nationalism. How do I become white? This is the problem that we're all going to have to face. Because if you want to tie this back into something like the Roman Catholic Church, think about those people that I just put into the melting pot about 5-6 minutes ago. Think about the Jesuits. Yeah, I remember them. Their educational system. Those schools were created because those first generation immigrants couldn't get into the white Protestant maintained public school systems or private school systems. So just like the HBCUs since the Civil War, the Catholic education system was done to help their own immigrant populations get as much education as possible so that by the generations going through time, they could assimilate into America. And boy, have they done that. When you stop and think about the majority of the Supreme Court justices who are Catholic, when you stop and think about the number of lawyers who were arrested and imprisoned because of Watergate who were Catholic trained lawyers, when you stop and think about how many times we don't know what their religion is, but we certainly do know that they came from immigrant populations who were being exploited and abused when they got off the boat or walked across some enforced border, and now are settled American citizens. Okay, public education. Okay, civil rights movement. There is a phrase, and I hope I can find it in a hurry, about, I think I can find it. Hold on just a second. Like I said, I'm going to be jumping all around the place with my notes. Okay. George Lipsitch, in his Possessive Investment in Whiteness, he has a wonderful phrase here that I think is really important for us to understand. Anyway, I thought I could find it. It's called resistance, refusal, and renegotiation. That's what he says has been the dynamic after every civil rights progress has been made. It's been met with resistance, refusal, and renegotiation. Voting rights. We don't have a democracy. The majority does not control who gets elected. The lobbyists of the far-right billionaires pay state legislators to pass laws that benefit them economically. And then they pay them to redistrict. So even though people died to secure voting rights according to the quote Constitution. Look at how many years, decades, almost a century of the Supreme Court misrepresenting the 14th Amendment, applying it to corporations and businesses more than to Black people. When you privilege the corporation and the corporation rewards you, that's a system of privilege of whiteness. And so now we've got people being redistricted in such a way that a majority of a Black population cannot have its own votes counted in any sort of equitable manner. So from the 1960s to the 2020s, renegotiation back down, refusal, resistance to it. Same thing is true, as I said before, about the public school system. It's as heavily segregated as anything that you could ever dread seeing in this country today. Healthcare. I don't care how many organizations that are doing studies on the disparities of Black women's healthcare. It's actually coming out of things like Thomas Jefferson or the origin of the species. Black people don't breathe, sweat, process their physical realities the same way as white people. I'm going to just read, it may be an extended quote, but I have to read it. And it just bothers, I cannot tell you how much it bothers me, but I found this when I was in graduate school. Immanuel Kant, for many of us in this presentation today, we know him as one of the great philosophers of Europe. The Critique of Reason and all of that other stuff. I guess that's what he did, because I wasn't that good in philosophy. But he, in 1843, gave a lecture that was kind of like one of the opening lectures in the field of anthropology. And he talks about the origins and the different categorizations of the species. And I want to read this for you. On the other hand, the extreme damp heat of the warm climate must show upon a people that has aged in it sufficiently to have become fully adapted to its soil, effects that are quite the opposite of the former. It is precisely the opposite appearance from the Kalmuk formation that is engendered. The growth of the spongy parts of the body must increase in a hot, moist climate. Hence a thick subnose and tumid lips. This philosopher, Immanuel Kant, is saying because Black folks are in the heated tropical areas, that's why they have spongy parts of the body which are increased. Leave that to your imaginations. Thank you very much, audience. But a thick subnose and tumid lips, swollen lips. The skin must be oily, not only to moderate the influence of evaporation, but also to prevent the injurious absorption of the noxious vapors of the air. The superabundance of iron particles, which are present in all human blood and which are precipitated in the reticular substance through the blackness that shines through the superficial skin. And the high iron content of the blood seems also necessary in order to forestall a slackening of all parts. Now, all the people that I grew up with who made sure I put some oil on my skin because I was ashy, they would have had to disagree with Immanuel Kant. But I'm going to keep on going now. I just got to do this. The oil of the skin, which weakens the nutrient mucus that is requisite for hair growth, has permitted hardly even the production of a woolly covering for the head. Okay. Besides all this, damp heat promotes strong growth in animals in general. And here's where it gets you. In short, The Negro is produced well suited to his climate. That is strong, fleshy, supple, but in the midst of the bountiful provision of his motherland, lazy, soft, and dawdling. Now, when I read that, I can't go to somebody's philosophy lecture and want them to quote Immanuel Kant. He also says that they have wide noses because the air is thicker in Africa, so we need to have wide nostrils in order to breathe it in. Now, he says all that. Johann Friedrich Blumenthal, also a scientific racist scholar, this is how he describes the Ethiopian: tawny colored, hair black, soft, curly, thick, and plentiful, head moderately narrowed, forehead slightly swelling, nose full, rather wide, as it were diffuse and thick, mouth large, upper jaw somewhat prominent, with the parts of the face, when seen in profile, sufficiently prominent and distinct from each other. This last variety includes some of the inhabitants of the Pacific Islands. Now, you know what I find so fascinating? That's Blumenthal and Kant in Europe. But what about Thomas Jefferson in America? Whether the black of the Negro resides in the reticular membrane between the skin and scarf skin, or in the scarf skin itself, whether it proceeds from the color of the blood, the color of the bile, or from some other secretion, the difference is fixed in nature and is as real as if its seat and cause were better known to us. And is this difference of no importance? Is it not the foundation of a greater or less share of beauty in the two races? Are not the fine mixtures of red and white the expressions of every passion by greater or less suffusion of color in the one preferable to that eternal monotony which reigns in the countenances, the immovable veil of black which covers all the emotions of the other race? Add to these flowing hair, a more elegant symmetry of form, their own judgment in favor of the whites, their own judgment in favor of the whites. Thomas Jefferson is saying that black people are fixated on white people because they are more beautiful. Their own judgment in favor of the whites declared by their preference of them as uniformly as is the preference of the orangutan, the ape, for the black women over those of his own species. That's the great scientist Thomas Jefferson, writing in the same decades as Immanuel Kant and Johann Friedrich Blumenthal. Scientific racism is based on complete prejudice, subjective definitions that justify the behavior of the people writing the definitions. And we all know that later on, Thomas Jefferson gets to be even sicker when he talks about the inability of black people to be sophisticated. But never could I find that a black had uttered a thought above the level of plain narration, never see even an elementary trait of painting or sculpture. In music, they are more generally gifted than the whites, with accurate ears for tunes and time, and they have been found capable of imagining a small catch. Whether they will be equal to the composition of a more extensive run of melody or of complicated harmony is yet to be proved. Misery is often the parent of the most affecting touches in poetry. Among the blacks is misery enough, God knows, but no poetry. Love is the peculiar ostrom of the poet. Their love is ardent, but it kindles the senses only. not the imagination. Religion indeed has produced a Phyllis Wheatley, but it could not produce a poet. Now, Mr. Jefferson, why you got at least 6 black kids? The only question I got to ask, but I ain't gonna be able to ask him that until Jesus brings him up at the last judgment, so I can get my questions in, because I want to be the other on the plaintiff side of the courtroom. Mr. Jefferson, I just have one question, and I know I'm saying that in a kind of a snarky sort of way, but remember, in that same book, Notes on the State of Virginia, that was starting to be written in 1781. The last question of the Notes on the State of Virginia. I tremble when I consider that my God is just, and being just will take no part in our endeavors. The nightmare of racism is something else that we have to deal with. The nightmare of it. Values command politics, but the politics command the economics. You think about, I was introduced as being, part of East St. Louis's history. You think about the East St. Louis race riots, but you think about all the lynchings and the massacres and the genocides that took place for people of color on this continent for economic advantage. For economic advantage. The frustrating fact of racism, especially when it's racism towards African Americans, is also about the body. And this is one of the most dangerous places that we can go, but we have to go there. Because white nationalism, especially of the variety of the evangelical kind of white nationalism, which is predominant in this country. Sexual difference, gender difference, color difference. Now, in the black church, they'll talk about and make, our souls need to be whiter than snow, but they know that's a metaphor. They know that's a metaphor. They don't take that in a literal sense. They don't. I've seen evidences of it all my life. They don't privilege it. But the white nationalist church wants to control the definition of everybody who is allowed into the building. You have to pass through a set of codes like you had to do to get on this event in order to be accepted in the church. And when you have a history of having to, you're not born a Catholic priest, you certainly ain't born a Catholic bishop, you ain't born a Catholic nun. When you stop and think about it, I'm not gonna dwell on or focus on the Georgetown 272 enslaved people who were sold and lied to and exploited and further abused. I'm not gonna deal with that. I'm not gonna deal with the fact that some of those people in Georgetown sent a group of priests and enslaved men and women and children to St. Louis to build St. Louis University and to have a plantation out in Florissant. I'm not going to deal with that. I'm not going to deal with the numbers of religious communities of women who, when a woman came in as a postulant, brought her personal body servant with her. Or how many times those religious congregations also own enslaved people. I'm not going to dwell on that. I'm going to dwell on the fact that the body has always been a source of fear and attraction equally in America. But that's been true of the people who are doing the quotations I got from the scientific racism world. And obviously from Thomas Jefferson. He can say all of that and then take his wife's half sister to bed and have babies with her. his wife's half sister. This is the complication of race and nationalism, because Jefferson, while he wasn't there writing the Constitution, certainly did write the Declaration of Independence and was mad at King George, not because he was forcing them to have slaves, but because he was trying to put together a system so that the economic advancement of American enslavement would not prevail over British enslavement. It's always been about economic advantage. One of the last great examples I would use, and this comes into the notions of the peace of Christ. The peace of Christ. White nationalism, validated by Christianity in America or in the colonizing countries, will never admit that their Christianity came from those countries that they have colonized. You have great scholars, including the ones who were doing the scientific racism studies back in the 1700s and 1800s, who have consistently said that the people of Northern Africa are not Africans because they got lighter skin, without ever understanding that the migration of the species came from the south up to the north and farther on into what is now Europe. But those people there was a necessity to deny all that, because otherwise you'd have to deny the Moors, the black folks, the mud-colored people, all over Europe, especially the Iberian Peninsula. You cannot have a Catholic Church without having African theology and sociology. You can't. But that's not the way we see it now, and we don't want to admit in this country that the predominant number of Catholics on this planet are not white. Who defines what a minority is and what a majority is? And as James Baldwin so eloquently said it about so much, majority ain't about numbers, it's about influence and power. So we have a majority of white power in this country, even though they are being fast eclipsed by a colored population. They know that. And that's why we've got redistricting. And that's why we've got a resurgence of people walking up and down the streets yelling and screaming, "This is our country, not yours." But it's also why we have, just in this past week, a whole slate of officers elected to be the leaders of the United States Catholic Bishops' Conference, who are anti so many things that it scares me, because they're proving that they are white, but they're not proving that they are Christian. The New Testament is the new covenant. Now, I'm going to, as I stop talking in a few minutes, as if that's ever possible, I'm going to read slowly, because I know that I saw the note saying, "Thank God you've got this thing, that it's going to be recorded because he talks too fast." I know that. I don't care. I'm going to read quite a long passage from another one of my great heroes. This is on a very personal level, but it's about what Carolyn sang with her song, "If I Can Help Somebody." I have been extraordinarily blessed on a personal level to have been embraced by, literally embraced by, anointed by, blessed by some of the greatest figures in our history. To be guided by Thea Bowman into the fullness of my appreciation for Catholicism. To be instructed on how to exercise that by Sister Antona Ebo. to have been held in an arms embrace by Bob Moses and John Lewis, to have Mary Lou Williams tell me at a dinner one night when she was performing at the Cookery in New York, that every day she prays for Black Jesuits. To have Catherine Dunham put her hand on my head and give me a blessing after a talk she gave in New Orleans. But to have had dinner with James Baldwin and to be able to tell him that his life and his writings helped me become who I am today. But my father was my teacher, and my mother was my mentor. They worked by seeing people in that great African tradition. I see you. That's what they taught me. But Baldwin, in his last published essay, The Price of the Ticket, he says a mob is not autonomous. It executes the real will of the people who rule the state. I contend that the mobs in the streets of Hitler's Germany were in those streets not only by the will of the German state, but by the will of the Western world, including those architects of human freedom, the British, and the presumed guardians of Christian and human morality, the Catholic Church. He says this: my diaspora continues. The end is not in sight, and I certainly cannot depend on the morality of this panic-stricken consumer society to bring me out of Egypt. A mob cannot afford to doubt that the Jews killed Christ, or that the niggers want to rape their sisters, or that anyone who fails to make it in the land of the free and the home of the brave deserves to be wretched. But these ideas do not come from the mob. They come from the state, which creates and manipulates the mob. The idea of Black persons as property, for example, does not come from the mob. It is not a spontaneous idea. It does not come from the people who knew better, who thought nothing of intermarriage until they were penalized for it. And to put a footnote on that, Judge A. Leon Higginbotham, 2 books, In the Matter of Color is one. And in that book, he goes back to the colonial period in the New England era and talks about how white people were penalized for cohabiting with Black people, indentured servants, white and enslaved Black. The laws are being written against them, and that's where we get the notion of miscegenation as a legal principle. This idea comes from the architects of the American state. These architects decided that the concept of property was more important, more real than the possibilities of the human being. And are we not living in that today? Baldwin wrote this in 1985, before Charlottesville, before the former so-called president said there were good people on both sides. He wrote this, of course, after all of the problems in Birmingham and Jackson and everywhere else in the South, where governors and mayors and police chiefs wanted to let everybody know, we will treat you like a herd of cattle because that's all you are. And this is what I want to read now to just kind of bring this to a close for me, for at least for now. In the church I come from, which is not at all the same church to which white Americans belong, we were compelled from time to time to do our first works over. Though the church I come from and the church to which most white Americans belong are both Christian churches, their relationship, due to those pragmatic decisions concerning property, made by a Christian state some time ago cannot be said to involve or suggest the fellowship of Christians. And I go back now, he wrote this in 1985. He did not know about the Georgetown enslavement problem, but he knew it. That's what a prophet does, speaks truth no matter what the day or time is. To do your first works over means to re-examine everything. Go back to where you started, or as far back as you can. Examine all of it. Travel your road again and tell the truth about it. Sing or shout or testify or keep it to yourself, but know whence you came. This is precisely what the generality of white Americans cannot afford to do. White nationalism, you can't handle the truth. That ain't a movie line. That's gospel. They do not know how to do it, as I must suppose. And this is one of the great classic pieces of Baldwin's prose, often quoted. They come through Ellis Island, where Giorgio becomes Joe. Papa Vasiliou becomes Palmer. Evangelos becomes Evans. Goldsmith becomes Smith or Gold. And Arvakian becomes King. So with a painless change of name and in the twinkling of an eye, one becomes a white American. Later, in the midnight hour, the missing identity aches. One can neither assess nor overcome the storm of the Middle Passage. One is mysteriously shipwrecked forever in the great new world. The slave is in another condition, as are his heirs. I told Jesus it would be all right if he changed my name, if he changed my name. The Irish Middle Passage, for but one example, was as foul as my own, and it's dishonorable on the part of those responsible for it, but the Irish became white when they got here and began rising in the world, whereas I became black and began sinking. The Irish, therefore, and thereafter, again, but for one example, had absolutely no choice but to make certain that I could not menace their safety or status or identity, and if I came too close, they could, with the consent of the governed, kill me, which means that we can be friendly with each other anywhere in the world except Boston. What a monumental achievement on the part of those heroes who conquered the North American wilderness. The price the white American paid for his ticket was to become white. And in the main, nothing more than that, or as he was to insist, nothing less. This incredibly limited, not to say dim-witted, ambition has choked many a human being to death here. And this, I contend, is because the white American has never accepted the real reasons for his journey. I know very well that my ancestors had no desire to come to this place, but neither did the ancestors of the people who became white and who require of my captivity a song. And this is it. This is it. They require of me a song less to celebrate my captivity than to justify their own. So what do I have to say about white nationalism in the church? You're born into a family that has values. You learn how to accept those values as being normative. You move into larger social environments like school, business, or the church. And you do better when you are in one of those new environments that correspond to and harmonize with the values you already had. And then you become successful because you know exactly how to adapt to comfortable prerequisites. The melting pot. And then you make sure that your children learn what you were taught, which is one of the reasons why you have this incredible effort to ban books about race, equality, gender difference, because we do not want to have to face the nightmare of our origins. As Brian Stevenson, another one of my heroes who has embraced my spirit, says in the documentary that they did on his life as the founder of the Equal Justice Initiative and the generator of the Lynching Museum and the Equal Justice Museum down in Montgomery, and the advocate for getting people off of death row and for stopping people to be inhumanely treated by the so-called legal system. As he says, truth and reconciliation starts with the truth. As I have said for years, the Catholic Church won't do it. We've had in my lifetime, two letters on racism in the Catholic Church published by the bishops. Neither one of those letters follows the sacrament of reconciliation. Father, forgive me, for I have sinned. It has been such and such time since my last confession. Here are my sins. Oh, they tell people how to deal with the effects of racism and how to be nicer to those people. After all, they are brothers and sisters to us. That's the ladder that Baldwin talks about again. They know that they're going to come down the ladder and help me come up a few rungs. That's been my life story for 75 years of my existence. People who think that they have done something that Jesus loves because they helped me get up a ladder that I never should have had to climb in the first place. Nationalism? Of course it's nationalism. Will it ever be better? Will we ever be truly reconciled? Of course we will. We're having this meeting today. Several different groups, the Catholic Racial Justice Collaborative, the Institute for Peace, Pax Christi. Look at what you all have done. You already know this. Baldwin is reaffirming. I could have done another 10, 15 minutes on Toni Morrison and her notion of racism and fascism. Again, she said that, she gave that speech to the Howard students, I don't know when, back in the 80s, early 90s or something like that. And she laid out all the different places that racism and fascism take root and how one leads to the other. I want to just read two of those elements. Construct an internal enemy as both focus and diversion, she says in her talk that she gave at Howard University back in 1995. Construct an internal enemy. Listen to what people are saying about those immigrants. Crime, 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 crime. Black people don't make guns. Black people don't import the drugs. America has been addicted to mind-altering consciousness strategies because the nightmare is insufferable. If we could sober up and be free of our addictions to racism and gender exploitation, classism, and capitalism, we would be Christian. And we would be the new covenant people. Because Jesus tried to tell us there is no alien and stranger, remember your enslavement. The new covenant says, look at each other and see yourselves. There ain't no us and them. There can only be us. So I want to thank you all for letting me do this.
Great, thank you so much, Father Brown. We've had a couple of questions from the chat. me see, we've got Mary Beth Gallagher asks, regarding economic advantage, we don't get to vote in Missouri about reparations. We need to take reparations into our own hands. What are our best opportunities to do this?
Reparations. Change the economic structures of the society you live in. Push people to monitor banks, to see that loans are given in ways that are respectful to how they had been denied in the past. Create opportunities for people whose fathers and grandfathers and great-grandfathers, male I'm talking, were denied GI Bill loans and economic and educational opportunities. And make sure that nobody is ever allowed to say that affirmative action means that the unqualified get advantage over the qualified, overqualified white people. Let's just tell the truth. Reparations is to say that the Constitution now matters because it has been amended to include blacks and whites, women, and the poor. That it's not about, oh, we got to raise money and give it to, excuse me, people who are descended from enslaved people. No. It's about making sure that Native Americans are given opportunities to come to our schools in groups enough that they could go back and make a considerable difference in their own educational systems and their own healthcare systems. And we could also make sure that there are fair and independent redistricting commissions as opposed to the gerrymandering of the unequal and completely immoral, overly mandated Republican majorities in the state legislatures. Or like New York had to do it when the Democrats wanted to do it in an unfair and immoral way, and the judge said, no, you can't do it. And all of a sudden the Democrats lost four House seats. Guess what? You shouldn't have been doing it in the first place. But I'm not into, well, you got to raise a whole bunch of money and give it to the descendants of, because that all comes out of there's only so much in the pie in the plate. And if we divide it up, we won't have as much pie as we used to have. Well, of course, you shouldn't be eating all that pie in the first place. Come on now, pay attention. Listen to those commercials on television. But the educational system, one of the ways that you could actually do something incredible for reparations is to have every state mandate that teachers be paid a living, respectable wage. And the same thing would be true of the nurses and the physician's assistants and the practical nurses in the healthcare system. Mm-hmm. That would mean, to me, be as much value, because if you had people being paid, the school teachers being paid as much as the athletic coaches, you'd have a whole lot better community of people in this country who would be able, and then to make sure that book banning is never allowed in any state.
Mm-hmm.
But again, I didn't promise I'd give you the answers that sounded right. Just,
Yeah. Well, and I should have introduced myself when I started. My name is Mary Pat O'Gorman. I'm in St. Louis, and I'm a member of the Catholic Racial Justice Collaborative. So I am monitoring the chat here and delivering these questions from our group. Talking about values command politics, politics command economy, economics, and economics command education. We have to think about what's going on in our classrooms, and the critique of critical race theory and the 1619 Project. Have you heard at all about whether the Catholic schools are teaching 1619 Project, and do you have any thoughts on that?
I really wish you hadn't asked me that question. It's been real nice now. I'm going to have to go to the grocery store. Goodbye. Yeah. I have problems with the 1619 Project. We Catholics all have problems with it. Now, I understand that when she took it out of the New York Times series, and put it into the book form, she had to correct some of the gross misunderstandings of that book. But it ties right back to the very first things I said. The dominating narrative. Everybody on this meeting knows, it's somewhere in grade school, we were taught that the Spanish Catholics came to America and they created St. Augustine, Florida, and they did all this other stuff in the 1500s, not the 1600s. We have church records from Florida of African babies being baptized in the 1500s. So why is it the 1619 project? Because it's white male Protestant landowners who have controlled the dominant narrative. Black enslaved people ran into the Florida territories because they were told that if you get baptized, you can be free. So you have a whole number of Black Union soldiers in the Civil War who are singing, and this is proved in Army Life in a Black Regiment by T.W. Higginson that was published in 1867. You've got a spiritual that he records in that book called Hail Mary. Now, you know perfectly well the Congregationalists are not singing Hail Mary. John Thornton's book is about the Spanish influence in the American colonies. We know this, we learned it, but we don't connect it. So I had a real problem with the 1619 project because it privileges one story over my story, which is the whole point of what I've been saying here. Now, as they told me, and she ain't getting no more money out of me, they told me that she has adapted the book version of it to include some of the criticisms that were leveled against the original series. And I'm happy about that. But as long as I have to go out and order the 1619 project, I got to spend a whole 2 class periods talking about why the title don't work for me.
Mhm. Mhm.
So I want them to be teaching something. And if the book has got the material in it that actually is much more respectful of the complicated truth of the matter, but we Catholics have got to, and see, here's the problem. If we Catholics do accept the truth of this origin story, it ain't like we're proud of it, but at least we're going to be able to take responsibility for saying the narrative has got to be complicated by what the Spanish and the French did. And that goes back again to the Haitians. You could not have America if it had not been for the Haitian Revolution, and you certainly would not have the kind of Catholicism we adhere to if it hadn't been for all the Haitian Catholics who came up here. Because after all, look at the group of women in New Orleans and in Baltimore who create the orders of religious women. Mother Elizabeth Lange, not Lang, Lange. Henriette Delille. Come on now, people. The Roman Catholic Church in America owes as much to women and women of color also in that group as it does to Irish clerics. And when you stop and think about the fact that America is once again a mission territory, but the missionaries are coming from Africa, y'all better wake up.
Mhm.
That's all I got to say about that.
Okay. Thank you. Michael Gehring asks, what are some of the ways that the Catholic Church condones racism?
What are some of the ways? Well, I mentioned just a little slight version of it is are those 2 letters, brothers and sisters to us, and open wide our hearts. Racism says that we are here to help you because we have the fullness and we want to bring you into as much of it as you can take. But that's not condoning racism. Well, of course it is.
Mhm.
When you stop and think about the educational system of the Roman Catholic Church, and I'm going to bring up the Jesuits again. because I can see that at least one person on this, panel is another one of my great mentoring spirits, Father Jim Hugg out of the Dominican house out there in the Midwest. We have in St. Louis, Loyola Academy. We have the SMET, St. Louis University High School. Across this country, we have the Cristo Rey Network, Christ the King schools and Cristo Rey schools. The Christ the King schools are focused on providing a high quality Jesuit sponsored education to a predominantly African American high school community. And the Cristo Rey, same thing, to a predominantly Hispanic Latino community. As I have said over and over as a critique of those two school networks, neither one of them have any kind of vocation efforts. They don't even consider inviting those students to consider religious or consecrated life or clerical life. We're here to help you, but we're not here to give you the keys to our kingdom. Condoning racism, we're letting you into our house for a time being. It's not our house with you as part of the we.
Mm-hmm.
And I find that mentality to be how it condones all sorts of discriminations. But the racial one, yes. And there's an unpleasant and often quietly stated dynamic that, again, may be quite unpopular in this group about who are the good minorities. When I stop and think about in the Jesuits, how many times I was told that I didn't have a vocation in the Society of Jesus because I didn't seem suited for community life. Well, I don't want to sit at a table where 4 priests are talking about what to do with the niggers at the high school. That's not community life. When I was told that I wasn't smart enough to be ordained a priest. And then after I got ordained a priest, obviously, I wasn't smart enough to get a Ph.D. And as the prefect of studies in my province at that time said to me, well, you like working with Negroes. What do you need a Ph.D. for? When you stop and think about who goes on to the furthest steps of credentialization, of fullness of being ready to perform your ministries, when you look at the people who you see, and I mean, come on now, you can't get no better than Wilton Gregory, a convert. So I go back to the Cristo Rey Christ the King schools. And it shouldn't have taken him all that long to get to be a cardinal. And he shouldn't be an exception. Because so much of the authentic renewal and restoration of true Catholicism as social justice is going to have to come from the people who have experienced the negative side of it.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have to wait until somebody finally learns what it means so that he can come back and say, oh, I didn't know this before, but I'm still in charge. And you don't need to have an auxiliary bishop who's black just because you have a lot of black Catholics. Why don't you have an auxiliary bishop who's black and you got no black Catholics? That might actually increase the number of black Catholics black people be interested in it. You don't need to be playing black Catholic, the spirituals and gospel music only during one weekend in Black History Month. Why don't you play it all year round? Because actually the spirituality in those songs will touch everybody in that church. You don't have to be black to sing Sometimes I Feel Like a Motherless Child. You can just be the victim of the public education system or the Department of Child and Family Services systems. Anybody can sing that song, and you don't need to have a certain color in order to sing Precious Lord, Take My Hand. It's so different if you just stop and think about what Paul VI said, Africa has gifts to give to the entire church. Excuse me. Why is it that we think, well, that's how I've had, at a conference just about 4 years ago in Chicago at Loyola, when somebody, a very prominent white Catholic journalist, made a comment about the kind of music that they're being sung in Catholic masses now that have nothing to do with Catholicism, like Amazing Grace. Excuse me. Excuse me. You may be a great journalist, but you really don't understand theology, do you? And you don't understand the history of that song. That song should be sung everywhere by anybody. The correct appropriation of cultural gifts is how you undo racism. But you have to say, I too am in need. We are all broken. I'm not here to heal you. I'm here to go into a process by which we heal each other. So anyway.
Mm-hmm. We have one question. Is white nationalism the same thing as white Christian nationalism?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
I think I have actually made something of a case for that. No, it is because what's his name? Max Weber, the rise of Protestantism and the rise of capitalism. God rewards me for it's the Pharisee in the temple. Lord, I thank God that I'm not like them. Well, isn't that so much of what we're talking about with the Christian identity? We are the pure, the sacred, and the blessed of God. And we're going to make sure that our political system and influence maintains that whole thing about values commanding politics. We are a Christian nation. No, you ain't. I don't see nobody around here running on a platform of love one another as I have loved you, from each according to their abilities and to each according to their needs. Acts of the Apostles. I don't hear that. Oh, that's socialism. Yeah, it sure is. And St. Paul, in the reading we just had this past Sunday, I understand there's some busybodies running around y'all community. Tell them to mind their own business and eat their own food. Well, wouldn't that be a blessing? But no, white Christian nationalism has controlled this country for a very long time. And it's about the money. If you have mega churches where you can raise so much money, you're certainly going to influence a whole bunch of people on the state and federal level. And the last thing, no, I got to bring this up too, because I didn't bring this up enough. I brought it up at the very beginning about the Constitution and the Second Amendment. But mass incarceration is one of the worst forms of racism we could ever experience on this planet. There are more incarcerated people in America than anywhere else in the world. And the vast majority are Black and brown people, and with an increasing number of women. And then you're going to complain about people who don't know how to respect and have a two-parent family when one of them's locked up or having a baby in jail. And then you say, well, it's their fault. They're all criminals. But you were saying that when you brought us over here. And you have defined what criminality means so that some people don't ever even get indicted, and other people, in Missouri, for instance, where so many of you all are, and Illinois, about cash bail. The whole trying to revise all of those laws. We're going to punish you for being poor. A poor, innocent person, as Brian Stevenson says, an innocent person who is poor will find much more jail time than a guilty white person who's rich. Well, mass incarceration is something that we're going to have to deal with, because we are still making incredible, obscene, immoral profits off of putting people into jails that are run for profit.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Don't get me started, please. Oh, because I guess it's too late. You did get me started, didn't you?
Well, we got a question. Bear with me here. This is a long one from Timothy Hall. As believing Catholics committed to our church's social teachings, how concerned should we be that some groups, e.g. Black Lives Matter, with whom we should be forging political coalitions to build a better society, hold different views on topics such as the nuclear family. This leads to the further question of how insistent should we be that our nation's laws conform to our own religion's tradition views based on such matters. So,
Well, I'm not sure I understand every aspect of that question because I don't know. I think we might have a problem with Black Lives Matter as a group because the licensed organization that uses that name is not the same
mhm,
as all those people who adhere to Black Lives Matter.
mhm,
I mean, let's get real here. And quite often the media help us to get confused and polarized because we're going to, well, those Black Lives Matter people. Well, now, wait a minute. It's the same reason that I tell people you can't talk about the Black community. Or to even worse, the Hispanic Latino community. If you want to talk about a social construct that is devastating and corrupted, it's to call people the Hispanic Latino community. You tell a native non-Spanish speaking person coming out of Guatemala, well, you're Hispanic, you're Latino. No, you're not. And you tell a whole bunch of people coming out of Mexico, you're Hispanic Latino. No, you're not, because you are part of the indigenous and African blending. And you tell the people from Mexico they got a whole lot in common with the people in Puerto Rico. No, they don't. So who is this Latino Hispanic community? Well, who is the Black community? I mean, until I was grown, a whole lot of people, in fact, a vast number of people in East St. Louis voted Republican because that was the old-fashioned way, because the Democrats wasn't doing nothing for them in East St. Louis. Now, it all changed after the time of Lyndon Johnson and some others, but it wasn't a problem being, I mean, they were Black and they belonged to the Republican Party for very specific political reasons on a local level. Okay, that's wonderful. But Black Lives Matter, their attitude about the nuclear family, I think that question might have been posted before I made the comment about the American economy is based on Black people not having a nuclear family.
mhm.
It's called slavery. A woman has a baby for the benefit of those who own her. The husband the father, since it was illegal to even have a husband. So how are you going to have a nuclear family? The father of that child may have been sold or castrated or murdered or all three in a sequence. Child is going to be raised by whoever is too old to work in the fields until that child is old enough to work in the fields. The American economic system is based on people having babies that can be exploited, which is why we keep hearing people talk about the school to prison pipeline. I don't know what a nuclear family is supposed to be, because in the Black cultural tradition history, there've only been a few decades where that was even possible. The Great Migration wasn't because people just felt like moving somewhere. All the laws that make Black men criminal. Okay, President Biden is now going to pardon a lot of people who have simple court convictions about marijuana. When you stop and think about the songs of the 1920s, I get no kick from cocaine. That was the original lyric. But then it turned into champagne. But when you stop and think of all the college students in the New York metropolitan area who went to Harlem so they could get drugs and sex workers, because that was all contained within the Black community by the police, the political system. So many of the ghettos had those places there, and a lot of the police officers and political figures owned or were part of those business enterprises. Drugs, clubs, and sex workers were confined in the ghetto, but the ghetto is blamed for that behavior when it was white profit-making people who made sure that those lines were put around there. We've got to stop and think about, where did the power rest? And who makes a profit off of all this? So I'm stuck on the notion about a nuclear family, because they have, Black women provided the raw material for capitalism in America.
Mhm. Mhm. We've had several people ask the question, can you say something about the financial hardship of the efforts to recognize the 6 Catholic African American saints and the importance of this effort?
I wish this was all in person, because I go down the aisle and slap that person, in a nonviolent way, of course. Yeah, it's going to cost anywhere between $3 to $4 million to go through this process. Come on, people. As Wilton Gregory has said it, Bishop Fernand Cherie has said it, Brian Massengale has said it, I've said it, and I know Sister Josita Colbert somewhere has said it. Y'all just ought to just lift up Thea right now, because she died a nun. And if that ain't persistence in the faith, I don't know what is. And the miracles she worked by not ever giving up on her faith in spite of what people did to her. That new documentary, Sister Thea Going Home Like a Shooting Star, that ought to close the case. The same thing would be true for a Julia Greeley. And God knows for Augustus Tolton, why do we have to go through anything else? The first miracle they ever did was to stay Catholic. I mean, that was a miracle. I know that firsthand. I ain't gonna be put up for canonization, but I know this: persistence in my faith against the obstacles that were to push me out. I was in a car driving Dan Berrigan around Omaha one afternoon, and he looked at me and said, "How can you stay a Jesuit and a Catholic?" And I'm driving, so I just glanced at him and said, "You of all people in the world asking me that question?" Dan Berrigan, locked up in jail, told by his provincial, "You cannot do this anymore." It took a rupe to visit him in jail to get that cleared up. You look at somebody like John Deere with his entire nonviolent efforts, having been told over and over and over again, "We don't think that this really fits the Jesuit charism, and you're not obedient enough." People, the miracle of persistence ought to be enough, and you don't need to raise $3 or $4 million to do this, especially when some people in the Roman Catholic Church got canonized within 5, 6, 10 years in my recent lifetime. The 6 venerable and blessed servants of God, you had 2 women of African descent in the time of official enslavement open religious communities of women in slave-holding states. You need a miracle? I think you got one there. And they died faithful. I would call each one of them a martyr, and this have the process go on the express lane.
Well, we're almost out of time, so we want to wrap it up with.
Yes, we do.
What would you
yeah.
like? I'll throw this to you. What would you like everyone to kind of take away from this today, and maybe an action steps or a follow up or something that we should take with us and talk to our families, our communities, our parishes? What's something you'd like everybody to take from this today?
There's another great song. It's me, oh Lord, standing in the need of prayer. The radical humility of knowing how we are broken, but knowing that we don't have to use the quote economy of salvation in order to be redeemed and healed. That we can learn from each other if we tell each other the truth of how we got to where we were and why we decided to keep on moving. Because the song that we started off with, "My living shall not be in vain," I think that was that was just an incredible spark. The prayer the Father did and the song that Carolyn sang. I'm standing in the need of prayer. I ain't ashamed to tell you that. My students look at me, well, first of all, they look at me like, are you really as old as you say you are? And I always go, yes. And I hope you didn't mean, did you think I was older? But no. And then they say, well, yeah, well, okay. Ain't you got a story about this, Father? Of course I have a story about it. But giving testimony, bearing witness, all these books and pieces of paper I got laying around here on this desk, these are all people who had to sacrifice something in order to tell the truth. But I'm going to close up when I started to talk about James Baldwin. My 18th birthday in the Society of Jesus, I had been in the Society a month. My next birthday, my father sent me The Fire Next Time. So in 1963, the year the book was published, I got a copy of The Fire Next Time. When I had been turned down for ordination and went into a complete post-traumatic stress disorder period of time, and I eventually got ordained, and then I was named superior of a small Jesuit community in St. Louis, and all the members of the community resisted me being in charge of it because they'd never in their lives had to be around anything that had a Black man in charge. I went into another tailspin and became suicidal. And a young man who's now in his 60s, who was living with us because he was otherwise would have been homeless, went down to the central west end of St. Louis before it was built up to what it is now, and liberated a used book from a secondhand bookstore in the central west end, and brought it back to me and said, you need to read this right now. And it was called Tell Me How Long the Train's Been Gone. But when I was studying philosophy before that, my father, I was sitting at home visiting with him in St. Louis one day, East St. Louis, and he threw me a book called Another Country by James Baldwin. I went back and started writing philosophy papers on that book. When I was able to meet James Baldwin personally and have dinner with him one night when he came to Yale to give a talk, I met him in the lobby of the restaurant, and I told him, you not only taught me how to live my life, but you helped me save my priesthood. He had a high school education. And he said, I'm not an artist. I just want to bear witness. If everybody in this group decided to just bear witness to the truth that they know can set them free, they'll be bearing witness to somebody else. You can do it too, baby. You can do it. And then we can all sing, this little light of mine, I'm going to let it shine. Everywhere I go, I'm going to let it shine. And I think that that's basically what my encouragement would be. Take the song and live it.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, thank you all.
Well, Mary Pat, I think I'm supposed to do a couple closing remarks, and then Father Brown is going to really close us with a poem.
Oh, I am?
Yes, you are. Yes, you were going to do one of your poems.
Okay, well, that means I'm going to have to, you talk for a while, okay? Just keep talking.
All right. I'll just do a few closing remarks.
Yeah, I did know, but speak slowly because we need to hear you.
All
yeah,
right,
and just keep, yeah, okay, great.
Okay, right. I just wanted to say that whenever I'm in a program where Father Brown speaks, I have to say I found myself always in amazement and realizing how much I don't know and how critical for me it is to know more. And I was thinking this now, I thought about the miracle of persistence that Father Brown talked about. And I thought, yes, that is a miracle. And that's something for me that I have to believe and work on. And standing in the need of prayer seems to me to be a really critical part of this. So I want to thank you again, Father Brown. I have to say I feel energized and like there's a real reason, an important reason for caring. So I'm really glad personally to have been here, and I'm glad for the number of people that were able to be part of this, were able to hear your thoughts and to learn the kinds of things that it's difficult for us to learn in other situations. So thank you.
Well, I appreciate that. And persistence really is a key.
Mm.
And I do actually, I just found something.
Good.
So I do have something I can actually read.
So we're going to be closed then. Close the session with Father Brown. Thank you.
This comes out of The Sun Whispers Wait, which I think somebody put in there in the chat room, some link to it or something, which I found to be quite beautiful. When Martin Luther King was assassinated, I went into a 2-day total meltdown. I couldn't speak to anybody. And I wanted to go to the gathering that they were going to do in St. Louis, and my religious superiors told me I couldn't. So I wrote a letter to my community and read it at dinner that night when I wanted to be at the gathering. 5 years later, I was invited to speak at, some of you in St. Louis would know, I'm still calling it the Kiel Auditorium. 5 years later, for Martin. Ain't a soul amongst us who don't know for sure, Lord, Lord, that we ain't in heaven yet, and our hell is standing still. Did you hear him shout? Don't you get weary? Don't you get weary? Like as not, we all old folks bent and twisted from the common misery, shading our eyes with crooked fingers palm high to the sun, looking out down the road all day. Who are we looking for? Did you hear him shout? Sooner we'll be done with the troubles of the world, with the troubles of the world. Did you hear him, children? Did you? So much time lost since I heard him shout, since I heard him sing, since I heard him pray, since he died at supper and they took him away from us. Some nights, dark and quiet, I get to nod in my head, thinking and listening once more to his big, spirit-filled voice urging us on to victory. Then my hand starts tapping on my knee and my eyes jerk open, straining to see him up there on his mountain, pointing out the dream, pointing out so much time lost since I heard him shout. Sometimes the tears still come. Sometimes I catch myself looking out the window for a sign in the sky or something clear and certain. And what I see is that wagon pulled by them mules, and all of us, Lord, pushed down into grief where there are no words, stumbling after, just hoping just to make it. So much time lost. My faith is slow rumbling like that wagon, and I'm tired. Lord, I'm tired of trying to hear him, trying to forget him. I'm tired of so much time lost, of quick pains in my hands and knees, tired of the shooting flashes in my head. Lord, we standing here. It seems why he left us looking out at Jordan, waiting for the signal to begin. Waiting for what? I heard him say, keep moving on. I know I heard him say it. Is he crying like we are now over so much time lost? Our tears seem to make the Jordan swell its banks. Weariness, don't you stop me. I heard him say it. Lord, I heard him shout. So much time lost, we still got today. Lord, do right, Jesus. Let us take the plunge. We ain't so broken yet that we can't move a mighty distance more. Shout it, children, shout it. For him, make Jordan shrink and tremble and move a mighty distance more. Like we heard him say, we still got today. Shout it, children, shout it.
Thank you, Father. And I think you sent us on. that's what we need to do, is shout it, children, shout it. Thank you.
Thank you.
All of you for being part of today. We appreciate your interest and we appreciate your willingness to spend this time dealing with an absolutely crucial issue.
Yes. Yes. Thank you.
And Kathy, just a quick note, several people had asked about a recording. It will be up on the Pax Christi YouTube channel shortly. It's been live streamed there. And it'll be added to the Catholic Racial Justice Collaborative website as well, which was posted in the link in the chats. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you all.
Right.
We got through it.